It's always like this in assembly, it's wonderful. I'm afraid I stand here guilty as charged. As a boy, I had the best possible education at the best school in the country. It was known as King Edward's School, Birmingham. People who went to Manchester Grammar School might disagree, but it was a direct grant school in the 1970s. And when I was a boy there, 90% of us were there for free, which is why it was an infinitely more successful academic school than Eton College, where I taught for 17 years. In my defence, I did not teach Boris Johnson. And in my defence, I did teach Rory Stewart, although he only got an A grade in my Latin because he forgot to turn over the page in the exam. I'm afraid I have that tale to tell, but I also returned in 2006 to my old school to be Chief Master, where I was for 11 years till I retired 3 years ago. And I suppose the contribution I want to make, having laid aside the burdens of being a head, is towards the informed debate which we're talking about. And I must say, having taught at Eton, but also having been a boy and also a head at what I would deem to be one of the great independent schools of this country, although when I was a boy there, it didn't feel like an independent school. I personally am absolutely sick to death of the world perceiving and presenting independent or private education as if it were people in tailcoats and people in boaters at Harrow. And every single photograph you see, whenever you see an article about independent schools, has such dreadful, ridiculous representations of the nature of independent school. I find it striking, and I've made this point to David Kynaston, so I'm not telling tales. When you read The Engines of Privilege, or when you read Posh Boys, when you go through the indices of those books, there's hardly any reference to many of the greatest independent schools. And I would argue that in the independent sector, the greatest, the most significant schools in the independent sector are not Eton College and Winchester and Harrow, the schools you rang, but actually the schools not far away from here. Manchester Grammar School, Withington Girls High, Manchester High School for Girls, obviously Bolton, Cheadle-Hulme, Stockport, those kind of schools. And they are an integral part, a fundamental part of the independent sector. Indeed, when we actually get down to some figures, some grad-grind type facts, in ISC there are 1,364 schools. The average size is not 900. The average size of those schools is under 400. Half of those schools are less than 300 in size. 645 of them, nearly half of them, are prep schools, are junior schools. So it's not surprising that those schools, confronted with the possibility of taking on an academy or providing enormous numbers of bursary places, it is not within their compass. And indeed, it's not even easy to keep those schools full. And the idea that every single independent school is selective, hothouse, elitist. I can assure you the little prep school where I'm a governor in Birmingham is none of those things. So one thing I would like to do in the informed debate is I think that for there to be an informed debate about independent schools, there needs to be much greater clarity about the wide range of different kinds of independent schools. And I think it's very important that this gathering, this group going forward, ensures that the complexity and diversity and different contexts of independent schools is made clear. And indeed, so many of our schools were at their greatest when they were actually under government control as direct grant schools. Once again, there's talk about lack of information, etc., and I quite understand that can be a problem. But in the report it says that there are some heads who are reputedly motivated towards bursaries. And indeed, if you look at your the last idea that you have, whether it be open access or whether reform from within, there's more than reputed interest in motivation to all those things. At King Edward's School, as at Bolton, as at Manchester Grammar School, as at Latimer Upper in London, as at Reigate Grammar School, and I could go on and on and on. The fundamental drive of the school and the head is towards greater diversity and greater accessibility. That's not all schools. The figure of 1% will not do. I think that's fair to say. But there are a number of schools leading the way who actually are in double figures, 15-20% of kids, whether on bursaries or at Manchester Grammar School, on 100% bursaries.
2 minutes, John.
When I look at King Edward's School, where I was for 11 years, King Edward's School and the high school next door spends £3.5 million each year on bursary provision. Well over 200 boys and girls are there for free. There are more kids on free school meals at King Edward's School, Birmingham, than in the grammar school, than some of the grammar schools of Birmingham. There are other institutions like Springboard, which are doing remarkable work in making it possible for children from very disadvantaged backgrounds to have the opportunity to attend boarding schools, and that came out of rugby. There are many, many schools these days working with an incredibly effective organisation. In terms of your reform from within, several years ago I went to a meeting with several heads to meet Michael Gove with Peter Lamport to volunteer precisely the kind of open access opportunity, and we got a flea in our ear, in our collective ears, and were driven out by Mr. Gove. But ISD are still have on the table the idea of that open access. To my mind, like Philip, I can't see how abolition works, and some of the changes will only end up with the elite schools surviving. But I believe, from what I feel of the sector, and I've just written a book about it, about bursary provision, which will inform this debate, and so get one quickly. I believe a combination of state school intelligence and, government intelligence in terms of thinking how we might work with the independent sector, because I know our schools would love to do that, and the very material growth of bursary provision which is taking place even as I stand here. I'm off to Portsmouth Grammar School tomorrow morning to talk to them about it. I believe that there are some mechanisms which actually will solve some of these problems over time far better than the idea of just knocking them down. Thank you.
Thank you very much.